Hello everyone, this is Behzad Fatmi. Welcome to our special interview with Dr. Ozcan Keles. Dr. Ozcan Keles is the chairperson of the Dialogue Society, UK. He is also one of the prominent Hizmet scholars and participants who have recently been publicly criticizing the Hizmet movement for various reasons. So in this interview, we will be discussing what, in his views, are the problematic aspects of the movement and what he thinks are the shortcomings in the movement. So let us start with our discussion. You're welcome, Dr. Keles.
Thank you, Behzad. Thank you for having me. It's been a while. We've been talking about doing this, I think, for some time. I think the first time you broached the idea with me, I was sort of completing my PhD. So we had to, put it on the back burner. But I'm glad we've had the opportunity finally to come around to doing it. So thank you.
Thank you. So can we quickly begin by with your introduction, please? So if you can just explain who you are and what you do and your association with the Hizmet movement very briefly.
So in terms of, when we talk about who we are, we often talk about our occupations, and because they define us in some ways, or we think that it does. I'm a British Muslim. I was born and raised here in the UK. I've sort of lived here for most of my life. When I was 11 years old, my parents took me to Turkey because they wanted me to learn the language and the culture, because it's very difficult when you're growing up in another country to be able to remain rooted, if you like, in quote unquote the homeland, if you like. So they had this thing about we should learn his culture, the language, and his religion and so forth. And so they took me to a school. I remember going with my father to this coffee shop, kahvehane, what would be a public house, a pub in this part of the world. And we're talking to this man, and my dad said, "So and so, this is what I want to do." And that gentleman suggested Robert's College. He said, "There's Robert's College, or Robert's College, as it's said in Turkish or pronounced in Turkish." And my dad said, "Look, if I wanted to send him to such a college, I wouldn't have brought him here to Turkey." And then so the man said, "Oh, okay, there's this school, Yamanlar College, is founded by this imam." My dad knew nothing about this person. Neither did I, And so we went, and it's a very secular school. I remember being shown around by the head teacher at the time. There was a sports arena in the back that was under construction, and they explained how I would be playing in there. And I graduated 3 years later, and the construction was still pending and ongoing, by the way. But anyway, but there was a sort of a religious undertone, a religious ethos to the school. It was socially conservative. All boys, of course. And my father thought, okay, so he can learn the language, the culture, be inculcated, if you like, in that. And so I started there. There wasn't, and so that's where I heard the name Fethullah Gülen, and you would sort of, you would hear at times, Hoca Efendi gelmiş, Fethullah Gülen is here. There'd be a bit of a bit more traffic in and around the school car park and so forth. But there would, I never saw him on campus, or you wouldn't interact with him, or nobody taught his teachings directly. The belletmens, the dorm masters, who are sort of volunteers that go to university, and they take care, if you like, of the students and the children out of school hours. They obviously prayed, and they were more religious, and they would run certain circles. So if you were minded and you were interested in that, and you wanted to explore it, that was certainly something that I saw them do. But I went at a time where I didn't gel with the kind of environment there, and it was very didactic and sort of, so I that didn't sort of work well with me. So after 3 years, I returned. But that's how I heard, if you like, but it was nothing that appealed to me. And in fact, I wanted to return back here. But really, my connection came when I went through an identity crisis when I came back to the UK. And I speak more about this at length in the talk that I gave with the Centre for Hizmet Studies last week. So if anybody's interested, they can certainly watch that if they wanted to. But I went through an identity crisis and wasn't sure where I was or who I was. And so it's at that time that I thought, well, maybe I should invest more time in understanding my faith and religion, because I was just becoming very reactionary and nervous about sort of internalizing democratic values that I thought were un-Islamic at the time. So that's when I went back and I started to study the works of Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, and I sort of, started to listen to the audio tapes of Fethullah. I did this of my own. It was my own initiative. And that's how I sort of connected with Hizmet. And I started to publish a magazine at a sort of Turkish school that I was attending for my Turkish A-levels. And I was trying to recruit people to write for the magazine called Bizim Dünya, Our World, and it was in the process of trying to recruit people to my initiative, if you like, when I came into touch with Hizmet participants here. And so I started to attend the kind of events that they were doing and so forth. And, that's how I was introduced to Hizmet. As you say, I am the chairperson of the Dialogue Society. I was the executive director of that organization for a number of years. In terms of, my background, in terms of what I've studied and done, I'm a non-practicing barrister by background. I've recently completed my PhD on the production of Islamic knowledge on human rights. And I'm currently trying to convert that into a book proposal to send to a reputable publisher. That's where I am. The most significant thing about me, I think, is that I have 4 boys, father of 4, spanning the ages of 18 at one end of the spectrum to 3 at the other end of the spectrum. You might hear them in the background. And really, that's what there is about me.
Right. So, of course, you have been associated with the Hizmet movement for a very long time. You got introduced to the movement in your early childhood. And you're also the chairperson of Hizmet's Dialogue organization in the UK, which is Dialogue Society. But a lot of my viewers would know you from the parliamentary hearing that you gave at the British, the House Intelligence Committee, I believe it was.
Foreign Affairs Committee.
Foreign Affairs Committee. So, that video was widely watched within the Hizmet movement, and there you defended the Hizmet movement.
Yes.
In a certain way, and very articulately, everybody really agreed with what you had to say, especially people within the Hizmet. But of late, you have started criticizing some of the practices in the Hizmet movement. You have your own perspective on shortcomings within the movement and how it operated in Turkey before the harrowing events of 15 July 2016, the coup attempt that happened in Turkey, and also how Hizmet is presenting itself or how it is conducting itself now across the world. So my question is, what if you can just begin by asking you or discussing what your major criticisms are about the movement?
Yeah, before I do that, Behzad, just in terms of background about the Foreign Affairs Select Committee hearing. So this was if I'm not mistaken, this was in November 2016. And you sort of started by saying that, I sort of defended Hizmet there, but more recently I've sort of been more critical. And I just want to, if you don't mind, put the record straight. I have been, so within Hizmet, when you're engaged in a Hizmet organization or a Hizmet activity, there's something called istishare, which is sort of consultative decision-making, where you sort of get together. If this is a formal or even if an informal organization, you sort of get together. And often this is done on a weekly basis. It can be done bi-weekly or monthly, but often it's weekly, where you get together and you discuss the project and you air your criticisms there. And I've always been, I don't consider myself to be overtly critical. I don't set out to be somebody that's always looking for the problematic things to point out. I don't think that that's what I set out to do. But in most of those meetings, and perhaps because of my background, because I'm an outlier in some ways, in the sense that I come from a different sociocultural, historic background in terms of my origins here in the UK, born and raised here. And so often in those kind of meetings, but also the general settings and the dinners before and the events after, I would sort of be raising points that I thought were pertinent. And often, that would be, I felt and believed it was helpful in providing a different perspective, and and some might have considered those to be critical, but critical in the constructive sense. So these are things that we were airing and talking about for many years, and colleagues that know me from back those days, from all the way back to.
Can we say that you started publicly criticizing the movement recently? Yeah. You have been doing it internally before, but of late you started.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just think that so I was sharing these. I began to be more vocal about these types of things, I think from sort of 2014, 2015 onwards, often through my Twitter accounts. In fact, when an extradition request was put in against me, they had most of my tweets that they had gathered at the time, and they had selected the tweets that they thought demonstrated my association with Hizmet. And some of the tweets back from 2014, 15, I think it was, were tweets in which I was criticizing Hizmet. So the Turkish government was using the tweets that I had posted that were critical of Hizmet as proof of my membership of Hizmet in the extradition request that they had sent here. So I was being critical. I was raising issues. I remember even drafting a list of 10 points that I thought a Hizmet participant could criticize Fethullah Gülen for. Okay, his failure of leadership, I think it was one of them from 2010 onwards. So there were things that I had pointed out, and I had shared them. And I'd given interviews at the time to Ahval and to various other news outlets, to the Financial Times and so forth, in which I sort of raised them. But obviously, I think the event at the House of Commons was the first time that Hizmet, I think, had a public forum in which it could put its point of view across since the Turkey's systematic onslaught against it had begun, sort of late 2013. So 2014, early 2014. So from that point onwards, Hizmet really didn't have an opportunity to be able to put forward its position in a public forum, if you like. So I think that was one of the reasons. And obviously, I think this was also one of the first opportunities that others had to sort of criticize and put their questions to Hizmet, and to hear Hizmet, to scrutinize Hizmet in that kind of a manner. Sort of Hizmet subjected itself to that. So because of that, that became quite of a highlight. And I think a lot of people saw that, and perhaps they didn't see so much of the other stuff that I had written before. So I think that's why some of this occurs. But I have been critical. But again, the point about that Foreign Affairs Select Committee is that the Select Committee wanted somebody from within Hizmet, ideally Fethullah Gülen, to come and talk and explain it. And we had offered them, and I had offered them, and I'd offered other people as well to come and talk as independent academics and scholars. And they didn't want independent academics. They already had that. They wanted a Hizmet perspective and a response. So I submitted written evidence, as well as we had the oral hearing. And in the oral hearing, obviously, they ask you a question. You've got 2 minutes in which to answer it. And so what we were trying to do there was to reflect an honest Hizmet perspective. We weren't speaking on behalf of Hizmet, but we were trying to say, look, this is the perspective from Hizmet. This is how Hizmet sees this situation. And that's the response that we were trying to give it. But if you look at my written evidence as well, which is online as well as on the Select Committee's website on parliament.gov UK, if you look at it there, you'll also see that I do hint at some of these issues there as well. But that context was slightly different. They had heard from the Turkish government, and they told us this, and now they wanted to hear what Hizmet had to say, and we were trying to reflect that.
Thank you for that clarification. And can we move on to
sure.
problems that you see are there in the Hizmet movement, that you think are there in the Hizmet movement, or the shortcomings of the Hizmet movement? So one of the things that what I recall from your social media posts and from the interviews you have given recently, you talk about the opaqueness in the movement, in the decision. That is one thing. And a major point that you raised, that should be there more transparency as the movement has become more global now. It needs to work according to the local standards, and also adopt practices that are suitable to the UK, for example. It's an open democratic society. It shouldn't function like it is still in the Turkish society. So that is one thing. But apart from that, what else do you?
Well, the press up, for me, the most fundamental, and there's lots of points that we can criticize, and I think it's really important to also say something else, just again as a sort of a preambular point, if I may, that it's at the crises are opportunities for complexification. As academics, as researchers, and you all know this, of course, is that what academics and researchers do is they take something that is mundane, something that is usual, something that we are used to seeing in a certain way, in a certain light, and they try to complexify it by asking it new questions, by putting it in a different light, by putting it next to something else, by disrupting the mental patterns with which we associate that thing, and asking it hard questions. And by doing that, what you're trying to do is you're trying to complexify it. And what that allows you to do is to develop new insights about that thing that you thought you knew. Right? So we have a superficial understanding about something. We want to learn more now. How do we learn more? Well, we have to ask it questions. We have to probe it. We have to prod it. We have to put it in water. We have to put it in air. We have to see how it responds in those situations to be able to understand, the nature of the thing that we're dealing with here. So, that's what an academic does, that, if you like, sort of artificially, in the sense that they ask these questions deductively from outside, But crises and problems and natural crises or sociological, political crises, these are opportunities for complexification anyway. This allows us to just say, hold on, what's happening here? Something has happened. Something was happening and it's changed. Now we've got a crisis. That's the definition, if you like, the most basic definition of a crisis. It's an incident that doesn't happen all the time because we normalize what happens all the time. A crisis is when we have a break. And so Hizmet has been given an opportunity in this sense to be able to complexify and just naturally ask these questions. What is it? And this should enable us to better understand the phenomena that we're dealing with and better understand how it can go forward. So this effort to criticize is not this armchair, you get these armchair academics who just want to sit back and criticize for the sake of criticism, and that, you can philosophize for the sake of philosophizing. That's okay as well. But here the aim is in doing so to develop our understanding, to develop our knowledge about the phenomena that we're dealing with. And from a Hizmet perspective, I think that's really useful because it helps them to then understand, what it is that they want to be doing and to strategizing and developing their thinking about themselves and so forth. And one of the good examples of this, if I'm not stretching this point too long, is that if you look at Islamic theology and Islamic studies and the new ideas and thoughts in this, often you'll find that it comes from Iranian Shia rooted scholars. And there's a reason for this. You have Abdul Karim Surush, you have Mohsen Qadawar, you have Mushtahid Shabastari, and various other theologians. And why is it that such disproportionate number of the new thinking and the new ideas and the critical thinking and the innovative ideas on Islamic studies and Islamic theology and Islam's relationship with the state comes from that Iranian Shia root? Is because they've had and are having a crisis right now. They're having a crisis of faith. They're having a crisis of political Islam because they've created the Islamic regime. The revolution succeeded. And so now that is raising questions that they're grappling with, okay? And that's helping them to develop their thought. So I think there's a similar thing in Hizmet in that we need to be doing that. And everything that I say really is in that context. But, my fundamental criticism is not the points that you mentioned so much, although those are points that I want to come on to. My fundamental criticism with Hizmet is the double talk. And I think we need to see that. So Hizmet set out by saying something. Hizmet set out by saying that Hizmet wants to represent civil Islam, not political Islam. Okay, that Hizmet it has a distance, it's apolitical. I don't agree with that anyway. But it said that it's apolitical, it's non-partisan. It has no interest in developing hard power. It has no interest in controlling the state or influencing political discourse or political maneuvering and decision-making in Turkey. Its interest was to win over the hearts and minds of people. Right? Its battle, if you like, if it was engaged in a battle, was a battle of ideas. And that's where it was. It was in the civil arena, and you saw this manifested through its schools and its dialogue projects, through its relief charities, through its philanthropy, through its media outlets and so forth. And all of that was in the civil arena. The problem occurred when Hizmet was saying one thing and doing that. To give Hizmet credit. It was in fact doing that. But at the same time, it appears now that a small group within Hizmet was systematically also engaged in something else. And that was actually trying to embed themselves within the Turkish state. Now, it's important that I clarify, I'm not saying all people all public servants that have a Hizmet background or a Hizmet sympathy were doing this systematically, but there was this outcome. We'll talk about the processes that led to that, but there was an outcome where Hizmet had a disproportionate number of its participants within the Turkish state, okay? And at some point, this appears to have developed into a systematic practice, an effort to do this, okay? And this, for everything else, is a contradiction on Hizmet's own principles, its own terms, its own social contract that it created and engaged with its participants and with wider society. Hizmet said, this is what we're about. And somewhere along the line, along this journey, parts of Hizmet systematically appears to have engaged in that practice. And that practice appears to have become systematic.
So may I just interrupt?
Yeah, please.
And ask the question. What I remember from your talk, from the Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, this question was raised to you, and the point that you yourself raised, pointed out that Hizmet had the best schools and education institutions in the country. So it was normal for the Hizmet graduates, the graduates of these schools, to be in powerful positions and the top posts in the country. So aren't you contradicting yourself here in that way? Because I mean, you also gave the example of a university or a school in the UK. I don't remember its name right now, but you
Oxbridge.
said
I said 57%. At the time, it was 57% of Oxbridge. So that's Oxford and Cambridge University together. So 57% of our permanent secretaries in the UK are Oxbridge graduates. And I said that this demonstrates presence. But parallel is something else. Yeah, we discussed this. So look, let me make it clear in terms of what I think is acceptable and what I think is unacceptable. I think that I think it's completely unacceptable to discriminate on the basis of religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or any other sort of identifier that relates to a person's background and culture and so forth. And I think that therefore Hizmet participants and pious Muslims have been discriminated against by the sort of the Turkish regime and the Kemalist origin, if you like, of that Turkish regime and the way in which it has become centralized and overbearing and micromanaging and so forth. And I distinguish that from Mustafa Kemal's teachings. So where you have a state that says, and a public employer, of course, that says, well, if you are pious Muslim, we don't want you. I think it's perfectly legitimate and ethical for people who are pious Muslims to do whatever, within reason they can to access those jobs, right? And I gave the example of Ahmadinejad, who said there's no homosexuals in Iran. And I said, if you're a homosexual Iranian and you applied for a job in the Foreign Office, would you declare it? You wouldn't, and it would be understandable because there's discrimination. You wouldn't get the job, and you'd be, I don't know if you wouldn't be crucified, but there's a very harsh penalty for that. And so, that it'd be understandable if you were not forthcoming. So I believe that there's nothing wrong with a Hizmet participant and sympathizer to partake in the state and to seek out public employment, to become a civil servant, to become a bureaucrat, to become a diplomat. I don't think there's absolutely none. Why shouldn't they? The rule of law, the principle of the rule of law suggests that. Meritocracy suggests that. And as I said, the idea of non-discrimination and equality suggests that. Now, so there's no problem there. Number two, I don't think there's anything problematic whatsoever with systematically trying to promote your participants from engaging and partaking in the Turkish state and seeking out employment there. So Hizmet could have opened enter the Turkish state academy tuition center opposite the Turkish military or the Turkish public offices, and taught people how to learn, how to study for those exams, and what they need to do to become successful. A bit like the kind of 11+ exams that we have here for grammar schools. There's nothing wrong with that. So for the same reasons, why shouldn't they? Once somebody, a Hizmet participant or a participant of any religious movement partakes, or any group finds employment within the state, again, I don't think there's anything problematic with that person seeking religious guidance from a mentor or somebody that is capable of providing them with that. So, in the United States, I think almost all of the presidents have had a pastor of some nature that they would, a religious authority that they would seek religious counsel from. And there's again nothing. So you could be in the Turkish military, you could be a sympathizer of the Hizmet movement, and then Behzad, you can go to your religious advisor, your mentor, your pastor, whatever, your imam, and talk about religious life and your spirituality in general. There's nothing wrong with that, right? The problem occurs when you start to discuss matters relating to your official duty with people outside of that domain. That is the problem, okay? And that's the problematic area. So once that happens, then that is illegal, it's immoral, it's unethical as well, for the reasons that I've said. So if within the public office there is a hierarchy, you have a line manager, you need to discuss, forget public office, at the Dialogue Society, I would be uncomfortable with that, right? If I've got somebody and I'm that person's line manager and we're discussing a project, if that person takes that project and discusses that with somebody else in a way in which they make a decision about it without, that's wrong at a number of levels, because that's private information that they shouldn't have taken in the first place. And then of course, there's the discussions that ensue and the actions that ensue after that. So all of that is problematic. And what I'm suggesting is that I'm not saying Hizmet participants did this all together. Number one, Hizmet is generally, it's very difficult to give it numbers, but the vast majority of Hizmet, perhaps 90 to 95% Hizmet participants, in terms of what they're doing, they were all within the civil arena, civil society-based projects, schools and education and so forth. You don't get to open 2,000 schools in 160 different countries without a significant amount of power, human power behind it, manpower behind it. So a vast majority of Hizmet participants were all about that. Some people engaged and sought out employment within the state, and not all of them did what I just said was problematic. But some within that group, I believe now, it appears that they may have done that, right? I can't speak definitively because, of course, these are legal matters as well, but there's more today that suggests that may have happened. And, we've got journalists like Ahmet Dönmez, who's exploring this through his articles, who comes from within that background, who has a Hizmet background, and who is now publicly writing and exploring this as an investigative journalist. That is problematic. And we can talk more about the context there, but fundamentally, when you do something that is at odds with what you're saying, you lose the moral high ground. And this is the problem that I wanted to raise. And so this is Hizmet lost moral high ground when it did this. And that's the fundamental issue. And you lose your credibility. And when you're a social movement, the number one thing that holds it all together is trust. Okay, and if you are saying something that is then being contradicted by other actions that you are condoning or engaging in, then you lose the trust. And the loss of trust is the number one thing that leads to the decline in social movements. Okay, and I think this is I was reading the autobiography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and in that he speaks about engaging in a public protest somewhere. You may have read his autobiography, but you're probably aware that he adopted the peaceful protest method. And while they were engaging in that protest, there were some shopkeepers that took part in the protest. They were not part of his movement, his group, and they started to pelt the police with stones and so forth. And at that moment, he says in his autobiography, he stopped the protest and dismissed the protest completely. He told everyone to go home, and he said he spent the next 3 days visiting the shops and explaining to them what peaceful protest is, what non-violent protest is, why they are doing what they're doing, and why doing what the shopkeepers were doing, or some of the shopkeepers were doing, was harmful. That's really important, Behzad. I mean, that's the level of responsibility that we need to take on board. And if I'm not over-laboring this point, if you permit me, I want to share an anecdote that I think helps illustrate this. I think it was 2002, 2003. I had the opportunity to visit Pennsylvania and to go there. And while I was there, if you've been, you'll know what the kind of the arrangements are. But Gulen comes out to give talks, and some of these are recorded and then broadcast. And then obviously some of those are not because they're necessarily very confidential, but it's just the way in which obviously they operate. So he comes out and he meets the people that have come there, and he gives a general talk. He doesn't meet people individually, but he sees them. There's about 50, 60 people there at the time. And I remember somebody who had come over from Australia, and this is the question that was asked to Gulen. They said, obviously Australia is made up of individual states, and we have dialogue organizations in those states, but the federal government is saying, if you can create some kind of federation, some kind of umbrella organization in which all of these different local dialogue organizations could come together, it would be easier at the federal government level to engage with yourselves. And so the question was not whether these organizations should dissolve and amalgamate and merge into one. That was never the question. The question was whether it would be possible to create some kind of consortium, some kind of federation, representative body, where these organizations would become member organizations, and that this umbrella organization could then do what it is that the Australian government was saying. And Gulen's response at the time was this. He said he disagreed with it. He said they shouldn't do that. And his rationale was this. He said, if one of your organizations does something wrong, then there would be some form of guilt by association, because they're all part of the same umbrella organization. And that would impact and sully and smear the other organizations somehow. Now, it didn't make sense to me at the time, and I put this down to Gulen's oversensitive nature, his scrupulousness on this issue of ensuring that everything that you do is legitimate. And I thought, well, this is a dialogue organization. What could it do wrong? The most I could think about at the time, I think it was that they may submit their accounts a bit late. There's sort of deadlines that you need to do that. Well, what could they do? And I just thought that it didn't make sense, but I put it down to Gulen's scrupulous nature, if you like. Now, look at that. Okay, so take that, what he's saying, and now apply that to Hizmet broader. Hizmet is a broad umbrella in that sense, okay? And we're doing all of this work, which is above board and makes 100% sense. There's no question marks about it. And then some small part of Hizmet engages in being present within the Turkish state, and therefore opens itself up to the accusation of engaging in what the Turkish state calls parallel activities. How does that, and how has that smeared and affected the image and the reputation of Hizmet globally? Look at that. And that's the big problem. I mean, this is the standard that Gulen himself had set. And all I'm calling out for is that actually that standard is respected, and it should have been respected in that context.
So you think the Hizmet movement itself is to blame for what has happened because of a small minority of Hizmet participants in Turkey? What they did in Turkey that has impacted Hizmet globally because there were structural problems with Hizmet? Or you think it's the Turkish state which is actually responsible for smearing the Hizmet movement, because we know that the Turkish diplomatic missions across the world have been lobbying with local governments to convince them that the movement is a terrorist organization and therefore they should ban them and all. So, so of course, the government, the Turkish government, the Erdogan regime is doing what it wants to do to smear the Hizmet movement and just finish it. But you think there are some problems within the Hizmet that also led to the present situation?
Let's be clear. I think that, look, the Turkish state, in terms of what it says and what it does, there's no comparison, right, in relation to Hizmet, I think. And the Turkish government is saying all kinds of nonsensical things. I mean, they're so nonsensical, they don't even make sense in terms of the Turkish government's own strategic objectives. The things that it doesn't make sense in terms of its own strategic objectives. So I think a lot of the time people fall into this trap of considering what they want to say about Hizmet by looking at what the Turkish government is saying and not wanting to give the Turkish government ammunition and so forth. I think that people are quite mature, they're quite sensible, they understand, you know, they can think of two things at the same time. So I think it's very possible to say, actually, what the Turkish government is doing is wholly unreasonable, unacceptable. It's a degradation of democratic values. It annihilates the concept of the rule of law, violates human rights. It makes no sense. Right? Let's put this aside. Right. So, but let's look at what Hizmet has done wrong and has done right. And it's only by doing that that you can, you want to defend Hizmet's positives, you need to be able to be critical of its negatives. Otherwise, it becomes propaganda. And that's really, nobody should be engaged in that. We haven't got the time and energy. Life is too short to be wasting on that kind of thing. And if there's something to learn from this, then we should engage in that process of complexification that I said at the outset. So I think we should just park Turkey and the Turkish government's ridiculous accusations, you know, that Turkey assassinated the Russian ambassador, Hizmet assassinated the Russian ambassador, or that it engaged in the Uludere activities and led to the slaughtering of innocent people. Now, if they have any evidence to back these things up, by all means, right, that's a different story. But this propaganda, this demonization, we have to see it for what it is. And that's another conversation that I think needs to be had, to look at the systematic dehumanization and demonization of Hizmet people in Turkey is phenomenal and eye-watering. And it has many parallels with Nazi Germany in terms of the demonization and the dehumanization of the Jews in the late 1930s and early 1940s. I'm not talking about the Holocaust. I'm not talking about, you know, the slaughtering of 6 million Jews. I'm talking about the lead up and the demonization, even the symbolism, the language, it's remarkably similar. So that's something that we can, of course, talk about. What I would say is that there is a context here. And when I spoke about this on Clubhouse, and a prominent scholar on Hizmet, sort of, it was interesting. I was criticizing Hizmet, and he's sort of a critical scholar on Hizmet, and he was sort of defending Hizmet in some ways by explaining to me and the other people there the context. And I think it's important to understand that, and I'm not oblivious to that. You know, the point he was making is that the Turkish state in the sort of 1980s and 1990s had this idea of synthesizing Turkishness with Islam, this idea of Turkish Islam. And so, you know, it was more welcoming of the role of Islam in public life. You know, and, you know, Hizmet's engagement with the Turkish state and Hizmet's efforts to sort of embed itself, if you like, or to partake in the Turkish state sort of coincides with this date. And he spoke about Turgut Özal and so forth. And that's fine. That's perfectly true. And I agree with that. Another thing is what I call GPS. I don't know if there's a sociological term for this, but I just refer to as GPS. And that's group protection syndrome. You might find a better way of referring to it, but what this is, or minority protection syndrome. And this is that if you are persecuted by an all-powerful, overarching, micromanaging, discriminating, controlling state, or something of similar nature, then one of the ways in which people attempt to protect themselves is by embedding themselves within that structure. So if they can embed themselves within that structure, then that gives them some kind of leverage and an ability to be at the table when these discussions are being made, and thereby to protect itself by doing that. And so you see this with other groups, and you see this with the disproportionate representation of other groups within Turkey, within the Turkish state. And I think that has happened with Hizmet as well, because the modern Turkish state was established on this idea of a sort of semi-aggressive modernization that otherized piety in the public sphere and religiosity in the public sphere. So although Hizmet is, you know, it's Sunni in terms of its religious orientation, it's Turkish in terms of its ethnicity, and so that it fits the ideal Turkish citizen. You know, shout out here to Ihsan Yilmaz, who's written about this. He talks about homo lastus, you know, laicite being the key thing there, Turkishness in terms of ethnicity, Atatürkism in terms of ideology, and what is it, Sunni Sunnism in terms of religious orientation. So it otherizes the Alevi, who is not Sunni. It otherizes the Kurds and the various other ethnicities in Turkey who are not ethnically Turkish. It otherizes anybody that adopts a different ideology. And so, yeah, so people that have been otherized and persecuted, and certainly the pious Muslims in Turkey have been, they seek to protect themselves and have sought to protect themselves by doing this. And this is why this is classic among many of the Sunni Islamic groups in Turkey are trying to do this. And so that's another way of understanding it. A third explanation, and this is something that Nick Ashdown, a Canadian journalist that's reported on Turkey for many years now, I remember him tweeting about this, and it sort of correlates with something that I was thinking about and makes a lot of sense. He talks about the US penitentiary system, and because they said that there's a disproportionate number of inmates in US prisons and the US penitentiary system generally, in relation to the guards that are there to protect them. So God forbid, if you ever get thrown into prison in the United States, there just isn't enough infrastructure, there isn't enough guards there to protect the inmates from each other. So what happens is often people gravitate towards a group or a gang there for protection. And he made from memory, he sort of suggested that the Turkish state in some ways and the Turkish machinery was like that. So if you want to excel within the Turkish state and you're a civil servant or you're a diplomat or you're a bureaucrat, the way to do it is in fact to engage in favoritism, to group with people that are like-minded with you. And, it makes sense where there is a lack of meritocracy, where there's a lack of rule of law. How do you ensure that you protect yourself? It's about knowing the right people. And that's essentially how the Turkish state has structured. And this is why Bill Park, who is a Turkey expert, says that the Turkish state, even today and in the past, has always been run on a basis of a parallel state. And what he means by that is that you have the constitution, you have the laws. This sets out how the state should be run and operated. But a parallel state is an operation of the state that is outside of what is written in the laws and in the constitution, and contrary to those, in fact, in some ways. And so, when you favor one another because you all happen to have a Kemalist outlook, for example, and you look on somebody unpleasantly because they happen to have a sort of more social democratic ideological orientation, that is a form of favoritism, that is a form of, if you like, a parallel statism. And Bill Park makes the point. He says the AKP currently is ruling on the basis of a parallel state because they can't do everything in the open, so they have to have these substructures. Similarly, he says that the Kemalists did the same thing. So all of these things sort of help explain this. My problem with Hizmet here is this. Hizmet was more of a sophisticated Islamic movement. And Fethullah Gulen places a great deal of emphasis on learning, on thinking, on critical thinking, on reading widely. And so the criticism is, why could Hizmet not have foreseen this problematic approach? So if you have people within the Turkish state, participants of your own, you're a civil society movement. You are in some ways, and if you look at social movements, are often created or emerge in opposition to the state structure, right? You don't have to be in opposition, but you are based on different values, especially the values upon which the Turkish modern state is created. What happens if you have so many participants within the Turkish state structure? What happens there? Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, he speaks about this concept called habitus, which is the idea that the habitus is the thing that structures our culture, our thinking, our outlook. It's, if you like, in some ways, the mindset or the bedrock of the mindset. And he said a habitus is something that you internalize unknowingly by engaging in any field of life, whether it's economics, whether it's politics, whether it's, social aspect of life. An example is, you go to the sweet shop you go to a grocery store to buy a loaf of bread, and everyone is queuing up. That in some ways is based on a habitus. And so you also instinctively queue up. Okay, that's how it works. Everyone is doing that. By partaking in that give and take, you also start to internalize the practices and the mindset that comes with that. So what happens when Hizmet's participants start to partake in the Turkish state? They start to become public servants. Is it inconceivable, or was it inconceivable to Hizmet that they would internalize the habitus of the Turkish state, the Turkish modern state? And what is that? That's statism. That's an idea of a centralized government. That's an anti-Kurdish sentiment. That's a xenophobic outlook. I mean, these are problematic aspects, if you like, and the mindset of the Turkish state. For example, I never understood this idea that Hizmet is against the rights of Kurds in Turkey. I never understood that, because Gülen was very forthcoming in his approach to that, quite ahead of his time, saying that people should have the right to education in their own mother tongue. But what I eventually came to realize was that, in fact, this came from the reaction of Hizmet participants within the Turkish state that had internalized this idea, the Turkish state mentality on the Kurdish issue, the Turkish state mentality on the Armenian genocide issue, right? So I remember having a conversation with somebody from Hizmet, a Hizmet participant or a sympathizer, somebody that looked up to Hizmet in many ways, and he was within the project, the team that was working on the E-State project in Turkey, E-Devlet. There are obviously many people, so I don't think saying that identifies in any shape or form. But he was saying how great that system was, E-Devlet, the E-State, the digitalization, if you like, of the state, but also the digitalization of citizenship in Turkey, and all private information attached to people, citizens of Turkish citizens, and the centralization of that. That's what the E-Devlet is. Any public body can access through your Turkey identification number. They can access your file and everything associated with you, and all the Turkish public bodies can do that. And he was saying how advanced that was compared to the British system, right? Because here in the UK, we don't even have nüfus cüzdanı, an identity card. Tony Blair attempted it when he was in power, and the people that opposed it, and the reason why they failed, was because you had so many groups such as Liberty, for example, a human rights civil society organization, that made the argument that said, look, the centralization of this, I mean, this information is there. So the state body has this information, but it's all dissected into different pieces. So when you go to your GP, they don't get to see if you've got, I don't know, a criminal record, because that's not related to your health necessarily. And so forth. So the information is dissected in accordance with the body, the public body with which you're engaging, whereas Turkey is amalgamating that all into one. And they pointed out how this could be abused, right? Even in this country with the checks and balances. And that's what a civil society organization should be doing. It should be trying to balance, act as a form of check and balance, and it should be making the points that are not being made and drawing attention to the blind spots here, okay? And one of the key things for Hizmet is civil liberties. Right? Hoca Efendi says, Muslims do not have an obligation to create an Islamic state. They have an obligation to seek out and to protect and support civil liberties. That's all we need as Muslims and as people of faith or no faith. That's what is required. There's no obligation for the creation of an Islamic state. So if that's the case, that's what Hizmet should be doing. It should have been doing that. Instead, you have people sympathetic to Hizmet defending the idea of the centralization of power and information within the Turkish state. And now, look, Behzad, look at where that's led us to now. Okay, so now you have women that go to hospital who are about to give birth, and they put in their details, and everything comes up. The police get informed. The police turn up. And I call this Turkish police at your cervix. So Turkish police outside of the labor ward or outside the very room in which that woman is giving birth, sometimes comes into the room immediately afterwards, perhaps even before the father, okay, and with that, before the family members. And that is a part of an outcome of this mentality. I'm not saying that if Hizmet didn't support it, or participants within Hizmet didn't support it, it wouldn't have happened. I'm saying something else. I'm saying Hizmet's mindset here got diluted by this. It got distorted by this. Mm-hmm. How can we ever be? How come a persecuted? Remembering here with reverence the late Dr. Zeki Bedawi, who said in the year I think 2002, 2003, where he gave an interview to Gay News, and he said Muslims are a persecuted minority. The gays in this country are persecuted. As persecuted Muslims, we cannot oppose or have anything we cannot contribute to the persecution of another minority, right? You have that. That's the approach that Hizmet needed to adopt, right? Hizmet needed to be able to be outside and be aware of the problems of being inside. Now, the argument that the Turkish state invited Hizmet in, and so what if they did? There's so many things that Hizmet was capable of doing that went beyond the habits of its landscape. In the 1980s, the Islamic movements in Turkey were opening mosques and masjids and Islamic madrasas and so forth. They weren't opening schools. Hizmet said, no, I'm going to do something different. It went above and beyond the natural practices of its landscape, if you like, and the practices that were prevalent at the time. In fact, because of that, Hizmet was referred to collectively as a murtad. They declared Hizmet to be infidels because they were doing something that was just so uncommon. So in the 1990s, where the debate was raging about democracy in Islam, and you had this antagonistic form of politics in Turkey, Gülen spoke about dialogue. In the 2000s, when the Refah Partisi was collecting donations from outside of Turkey to bring into Turkey, Hizmet was doing the opposite. My point is, Hizmet is capable and has demonstrated its capability to do the uncommon, to transcend its context. So the idea that the context here is an excuse is not for me, and this is the problem, Behzad.
So
it compromised. It compromised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to summarize, can we say that, I mean, one of the Hizmet calls itself a civil Islam organization, a movement believing in civil Islam, not in political Islam. So in political Islam, of course, the political Islamists, their major aim is to grab power, and then they think that they will be able to transform the society the way they like. But on the contrary, the civil Islamists, they can say, those believing in civil Islam, they think of investing in person and dealing with individuals and slowly changing. If I change myself, if I change my family, and if I change my relatives and my friends, maybe have them positively influenced by the ideas, and then slowly the society may change, and the positive things that I believe are there will come into the society. So in this case, are you saying that Hizmet, when Hizmet participants entered the state and they started taking positions in state institutions in Turkey, rather than influencing the system there, they themselves got influenced by the existing structure and the practices and the ideology, the way of functioning over there?
They replicated. So if you, as I said, if you go into the Turkish state, if you create a presence there, then you're in a system, and now you have to. You've already made the choice of being a part of that system. Okay, so now you need to figure out how you remain intact, how you excel, how you do good things. And this could be out of good intentions. I'm not saying there's bad intentions here, right? But it doesn't change the fact that that's your mindset now. So how do I protect myself? Now, you can't rely on the rule of law. You can't rely on meritocracy. You can't rely necessarily on a senior line manager, because so much in Turkey depends on who you know. So much on Turkey depends on favoritism. Okay, so what you do is you replicate the practices and the habitus of the environment in which you are taking part. You replicate it, and in replicating it, you become part of the problem that you were pointing out. Okay, so you were saying this is problematic, and then you start to do the problematic things yourself. Okay, so for example, yes, there is this thing about not being open about your identity because there's persecution. You get persecuted, and I get that and I understand that. But it's 20 years in the US. Hizmet has been in the United States for over 20 years now, in Europe 20 years. Surely we should have now overcome that, right? Because it's a different habitus now in which we are. But there's something that perpetuates that in Turkey, this securitized mindset And what perpetuates this in part is your presence within the Turkish state. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so when you take part in an organization that with which you have fundamental problems at the outset in terms of its culture, in terms of its habitus, as I said, in terms of its practices, the only way you can in fact demonstrate your criticism for that is to in fact come out of it, step out of it. If you remain in it and you remain in it intact and you get stronger within it, well, how are you doing that? You're replicating successfully what you're seeing there, okay? And that's the problem. So favoritism, look, you have favoritism in British universities and academia here. It's very prevalent. It's prevalent in many parts of the world. More so in Turkey, I would say, in places like that, because you need to rely on like-minded people, because you can't rely on independent institutions. You can't rely on the judiciary, okay, to adjudicate on these issues, to have your back, so to speak. Or you can't rely on the code of conduct or the institutional conventions of that institution, because it's just not there. It's eroded. It's corroded. It never was there, or it's problematic to begin with. So you then rely on each other. So favoritism. Now that's a massive problem. Okay, so some of the resentment that Hizmet has is because of this, that Hizmet was very successful. Remember, I said that a lot of minority groups do this. Well, Hizmet statistically is not a minority. There's a lot of people in there. Okay, so although the vast majority of Hizmet people did not do this, still statistically speaking, Hizmet has a lot of people and participants and supporters. So it was able to successfully partake in the Turkish state. And as a result of replicating these problematic practices of favoritism and so forth, what happened is it created a lot of resentment in other people. Okay, but when I've raised this with Hizmet people, when I say with certain people, when I say, look, our thing was about schools. Come on, let's have an honest conversation. We were about education, dialogue, strengthening civil society, philanthropy. This is what we were about. Okay, what do we need to do? Why is there, I can understand natural selection. Some people just want to become a civil servant. That's fine. But why have this fascination with the Turkish state, right? Why have some of your best, brightest, why encourage them there? And so they would say to me, look, do you think these schools could have opened if you didn't have also one leg in this other part of society? Because the state is, of course, the thing that creates and reproduces society. And they would say, well, do you think it would be possible? And that's where we have a fundamental break, because I believe that Hizmet's activities in civil society were idealistic. They were based primarily in idealism. We wanted to do something out of an idealistic, altruistic projection, okay, an idea. And it's really problematic when you take that and then mix it with pragmatism, because the second is pragmatism. I remember watching Ebru TV, and the Turkish state is doing that now, and it's borderline comical. But Ebru TV is a Hizmet channel based in the United States that was broadcasting in English, and they were referring to Turkey as Türkiye in the pronunciation, the Turkish pronunciation, rather than Turkey, because of
that's what the negative ministries are doing these days.
They are doing that. They're co-opting that, if you like. I don't know who started this or where it started. It may have been that the Turkish state did this back in the days. I don't know. But I remember seeing this in the 2000s, Ebru TV doing that. I'm like, what are they doing? This is a minor, small, Hizmet-based TV channel that's broadcasting in the United States with a tiny share of people watching it. Why? What is it trying to do? It makes no sense. It only makes sense if you look at it from an idealistic perspective, right? So it doesn't matter whether it changes the pronunciation of the word and the noun. It doesn't matter whether it achieves that. This is taking a principled stand, and I respect that. I can respect. The problem is when you say that and do that, and then on the other hand you say, well, we had to compromise on our principles. We had to adopt this sort of pragmatic approach, or pragmatism more specifically, in order to continue and perpetuate the idealism. That is a concoction that you want to avoid, because then where does it end? Okay, that's a very slippery slope. And my thing is, so what if they, let's say that the Turkish state didn't allow Hizmet to open 2,000 schools in 160 countries, or 800 schools in Turkey, or whatever. They didn't allow you to do it. Fine, let them not allow it to do it. Let them not allow us to do that. Let's imagine, that they weren't going to, they were going to persecute Hizmet previously, earlier than they are right now. They're persecuting Hizmet now anyway. So what you realize from this is there's no appeasing, a bully. One way or another, they'll come back to haunt you. But so what if they do? Our point here is not to win. And this goes to a deeper issue about, Islamic theology and Islamic history more generally, where we've sort of conflated being righteous and Islamic with winning, with glory. And that's the big problem, Behzad. It's the way that we read our Islamic history. The Prophet is always winning the wars that he engages in. Well, that's not true, historically accurate, right? The companions, we always whitewash the period immediately after the Prophet's death, and even his funeral, right? We whitewash all of that and the wars among the companions. And so we have this sterilized Islamic history that is sort of the Muslims are always victorious in the worldly sense. And so we must be victorious if we are blessed, if we are righteous, because that's what we're seeing historically. And so therefore, if there is something that we need to do that is just slightly not in accordance with our principles and our teachings, then perhaps we can do that to achieve that victory and victorious status. What Hizmet should have done, and I've said this before, is we don't believe as Muslims in the crucifixion. We don't believe that Christ was crucified, but the crucifixion itself is very symbolically loaded and powerful. And what it tells us is that there is life in death, that there is victory in loss. Okay, Christ, according to the story there, was crucified. He was killed. He was murdered, and he had a worldly death. Okay, but that created an enduring message, okay, that transcends that event. And through that, there is glory, there is victory. Okay, and so Hizmet's situation in this context, you can't be expected to win a war against an enemy. I mean, that's how they see themselves. So Turkish state. So you can't be expected to win a war against a self-identified enemy that has gone beyond the rule of law and is now operating unlawfully, illegally, and criminally. How are you supposed to win unless you also replicate those behaviors? Hizmet's position in that situation was to be crucified. That was the responsibility, if you like. Hizmet needed to be crucified, and that would have been fine because of the symbolism that would have brought with it. Because we were supposed to stand up for something.
Right. It has already been.
I'm just going to turn. Sorry, I'm getting messages. So let me just turn this off. Sorry, that's not. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so it's already over an hour. Let this be my last question. And of course, if after this you have something to add, of course, you are welcome to do that. So what I wanted to ask is, journalist Mehmet Ali Biran, who in a very famous article said that Hizmet movement, Hizmet's influence and power is being deliberately exaggerated in the Turkish society. And one day, the movement will become a victim of this perception, this exaggeration. So, do you agree with this theory? Do you really think that the Turkish state exaggerated Hizmet's power and influence, and the Hizmet movement believed in it? Hizmet's participants believed in it, and later on, this was used to scapegoat Hizmet for everything that went wrong in Turkey. So as you also mentioned, the assassination of the Russian ambassador, so the alleged assassination of Mohsin Yazidioğlu, and the Uludere massacre.
All of those things, by the way, came up during my extradition hearing. So those were things that not just Hizmet in general, but they were making the point that my association with Hizmet meant that I was guilty of these things as well. Sorry, carry on.
Yes, exactly. And I was there at your hearing, one of the hearings, so I am witness to that. So yes, I mean, all the Turkish state then used this perception to scapegoat Hizmet movement with everything that went wrong in Turkey. And of course, the biggest accusation is that the movement orchestrated a coup in Turkey. So you do you agree with what Biran had to say in his article?
Yeah, definitely. So this was an article I think published in 2010 in Hürriyet, and I remember, I think reading it at the time or near thereafter. And I also said, I already said, Behzad, that what Turkey is doing, the Turkish government is doing, and the Turkish authorities are doing, are criminal, illegal, anti-democratic to the core. I mean, to call it anti-democratic is to sort of is not to do it justice. I mean, what they're doing is extremely cruel. It's vindictive. It's inhumane, right?
And perhaps I could just quickly add that it is well documented in Ozcan Keles' article. His book that has recently come up.
The making of a genocide. Yeah, of course. And it's not. It's multi-layered and multifaceted. So it's not just the unlawful arrests and the dismissals and but it's also the demonization, the dehumanization through media. It's also organizing society, manipulation through various means, almost every tool that they have to create a society that is breeding this resentment and anger and hatred. And almost every group in Turkey is being persecuted without doubt. Any group that is not an avid, diehard AKP supporter is a potential enemy, right? I mean, that's the thing. And so every category of people, secularists and Kurds, of course, Armenian, Turks, and people of a Muslim background, Hizmet, of course, there, but also other groups, the Furkan Vakfı group and so forth. Anybody that sort of demonstrates some level of independence. And of course, themselves, they're persecuting one another. Ahmet Davutoğlu, right, was sort of toppled as the prime minister of a legitimate government, having just successfully won an election. So it's multi-layered, it's multifaceted, it's extraordinary in its breadth and depth in that. And in terms of the accusations, yes, I agree. It makes a lot of sense that the Turkish state is well practiced in the art of bringing something up and then tearing it down. And so, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that they would have done that. All of that needs to be factored into account, and we need to be very critical of that. But the reason why I like to focus within Hizmet, Behzad, is that there's a lot of that discussion anyway. So a lot of people within Hizmet and outside of Hizmet are sort of discussing and debating Turkey. And at the second level, it's very obvious as well, right? So when you take a step back, it's very obvious to a lot of people. Nobody's surprised by that. There's very little that I can say to anybody about what's happening in Turkey that surprises anybody. That's how low the expectations are of this current government. How much more do we need to dwell on that? Of course, it needs to be said, but it already is being. So the reason why I focus on looking within Hizmet is because those are things that can be changed. Okay, and if Hizmet has a responsibility within itself, and Hizmet's message has always been about changing the immediate rather than the afar. The Islamist agenda is always about talking about things that you have very little power over. Okay, and often you neglect the things within your remit and within your vicinity. Hizmet's message, in contradistinction to that, has always been about changing yourself, changing your society, changing what you can with your community, and taking on responsibility. Gülen's message of responsibility is overwhelming. And so all of these things culminate into the necessity for Hizmet to be able to look at itself and say, well, what can we do? What have we done wrong? How can we do better? And in doing that, Hizmet can learn from its mistakes. It can take the social capital and the religious capital that it's created and generated over the years and avoid its being squandered. Okay, because there's a vicious circle that a lot of Islamic groups go into, and Hizmet is also, appears to be in a similar vicious circle as well. And Hizmet needs to be able to avoid that and use that capital by directing it towards social cohesion, by directing it towards reconciliation within society. And Hizmet's message has always been, if peace will come from our annihilation, even if it comes from our annihilation, then we would, self-annihilate, in some ways, metaphorically speaking. We're willing to make that sacrifice. If me saying sorry is going to end this pain and misery, okay, then we should be willing to do that. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that Hizmet should apologize for things that it hasn't done. I'm saying Hizmet should engage in a form of self-critical reflexivity that allows it to genuinely say, look, this is what Hizmet did. This is what where it made a mistake. And that's why I think it's really important to sort of focus on that. And one of the things there, like, so when you take Mehmet Ali Biran's article, of course he says that, but let's put that aside, because that takes us to discuss them. And what's interesting me about that is, why was Hizmet in a position that it could be so easily manipulated? That's the question. How did Hizmet become so easily manipulated here? That's what we need to learn from. I mean, how is it that this sophisticated movement that is so widespread, that has a sort of a collectivity of world knowledge as a result of not just, its bookish students and scholars, but also experiential knowledge? How is it that it could not foresee this? Is it possible? And in fact, it's not possible. It did foresee this. I mean, the literature on social movements, Behzad, tells you this. It tells you that when a social movement becomes so successful, it often creates a counter movement. And the counter movement is there to then eat into the success of the movement. So that's why in social movement outcome theory often talks about waiting for a social movement to die before taking account of how successful it was, because the more successful it is, the more likelihood is that it will create a backlash. How is it that Hizmet didn't see this? How is it that Hizmet, for example, this idea that Gülen had, and I'll say it in Turkish first, he says, her yerde olmayan hiçbir yerde olamaz. If you are not everywhere, then you are nowhere, right? And this was quite a thing. And the idea here was, it wasn't a negative thing. It was, you should be in every domain of life. If it's being a doctor, you should be a doctor. If it's being a judge, you should be a judge. Because previously, pious Muslims were given these sort of very small areas in which they could operate. And so you should break the glass ceiling upwards, but also the glass walls in your sides, right? And that sort of encapsulated you and imprisoned you. So this is a positive message. It's a message of upward social mobility. It's a message of empowerment. But how did that evolve into sort of trying to become and have some form of representation in every sphere of life? And what happens, does this not evolve into this form of expansionism, right? And I give the example of The Matrix. When you look at The Matrix, the movie and the trilogy, you see Agent Smith who sort of replicates himself, and then Neo sort of to balance out Neo. So when Hizmet is sort of encouraging its participants to be active in so many parts of the world and so many spheres within a given country, how does that upset the wider balance within that country, right? Especially when you can't have transparency at the same time. So is it not our responsibility to think, look, if we have 800 or 1,000 schools, Behzad, think about this, 1,000 schools in Turkey, okay, and there's no transparency. It's not your fault that there's no transparency, fine. But what does that do to trust, right? Isn't that also a part of your responsibility to think about how that might create suspicion, how your presence in so many parts and so many spheres of life might create people to be upset and concerned? Doesn't that make it easier for you to be manipulated? Isn't this some form of a positivistic thinking that somehow numbers translates into impact and effect, right? What about the opposite? What if we could have said, to be somewhere, you need to avoid the temptation of being everywhere. You need to be consistent. And what we needed to be is not to be everywhere. We needed to be somewhere, in terms of our principles, our ideals, our practices, somewhere. And that somewhere needed to be principled. It needed to have moral integrity. And that would have allowed our message to resonate everywhere. Instead, Hizmet did the opposite. It physically tried to be everywhere. And the result of that was to create the kind of animosity and the resentment that we're currently seeing. And that, I think, is something that we need to debate within Hizmet. We need to learn from.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is, I think, a very important point, and an important point to end also this interview. Thank you so much, Ozcan, for joining me for this special interview. And I have done something of this sort for the first time for my channel. I hope my viewers will like it.
I'm
And
glad to be your. I'm glad to be your first.
thank you. Thank you so much. So, of course, if you have something more to add, something to add in conclusion, we can have that then.
Look, I mean, I'm grateful to you, Behzad, because it was important to be able to. Often, criticism or discussions about the limitations of Hizmet becomes an afterthought. We often talk about what's good and great, and then you have a little bit of 10, 5, 15 minutes to talk about what the limitations and the criticisms are. And I think it's really important to reverse that, to talk about the criticisms and limitations, and make that the center. And in my notes, we've spoken about one issue in particular, this double talk, and how that relates to transparency, how that relates to Hizmet in the state and within civil society. There's so much more, the Turkishness about Hizmet, the replication of Hizmet's product rather than the methodology and so forth. So there's a lot more to discuss. And I think that it's important that we do this publicly. It's important that this is done in the public domain so that it contributes to the development of the thought about Hizmet and Hizmet participants. So I'm grateful to you for that, and apologies for, talking over you if I have at times, and for the long-winded responses. Thank you.
No, not at all. Thank you so much.